you are about to hear has been hidden for generations, but the time has come to reveal it. The Bible code hidden in the destruction of Sodom. The hidden Torah. Have you ever heard of the Torah secrets they never preached? There's a Bible code hidden in the ancient Hebrew texts, one that reveals why Sodoma was truly destroyed and what it means for our time. This is not religion. It's a forgotten prophecy, breaking a silence that lasted for centuries. What you're about to hear has been concealed for generations, but now it must be known. Have you ever felt something was deeply wrong, even when you couldn't explain it? Like the world around you was spinning too fast and something sacred was slipping through the cracks? That's how I felt that night, walking through the shadowed streets of Sodoma. The air smelled like cheap perfume and hidden despair. Women smiled without joy. Men traded pleasure like bread. One of them called to me from a doorway, "Hey, handsome, looking for fun?" Her voice was sweet but hollow. I didn't answer. I just kept walking, as if my feet already knew something greater was waiting on the other side of that corrupted city. Because Sodoma wasn't just a place of sin, it was a mirror of what happens when man drifts too far from his soul. Far ahead, I saw the wooden sign of an old tavern. I stepped inside. The heat was thick, with steam, sweat, and freshly baked bread. And there, sitting alone in the back, was a man whose presence shifted everything. When he pulled back his hood, my heart froze. It was my uncle, Abraham. He looked into my eyes as if he could see beyond time. "Lot," he said, "you must leave this place now." For a moment, the world stood still. I felt the weight of something not from this earth. It was as if God himself was speaking through him. A disaster was on its way, and there was no time left. What Abraham said wasn't advice. It was a warning, a final invitation. The streets of Sodoma were full, yet spiritually hollow. It was as if the outcry of the earth had finally reached heaven's throne, and the answer was already descending. Slowly I began to understand. Judgment doesn't fall suddenly. It falls when heaven can't stay silent anymore. If you too feel heaven is about to speak, subscribe to the Hidden Torah. Some messages can't wait any longer. Abraham intercedes for Sodoma. Sometimes all that stands between judgment and an entire city is the prayer of one man. Heaven had already declared destruction upon Sodoma, but Abraham stood between the heavens and the earth, not as a judge, but as an intercessor, a man who dared to question the Creator, not out of rebellion, but compassion. And that's when the hidden mystery began to unfold. Lord, will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? That one question changed everything. The Torah presents this scene with sacred weight. Rashi explains that Abraham spoke with fear, yet boldness, like a son who knows the heart of his father. He didn't ask for riches or fame. He asked for mercy, for people who didn't even know they needed it. Abraham counts downward like stepping down a spiritual ladder, 50, 45, 40, down to 10. The Zohar teaches that these numbers weren't random. Each step represented a type of righteous soul, a spiritual spark that could uphold the entire city. If only there were 10. If only, but the answer was final. There weren't even that many. In the end, only 4 were counted as righteous: Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters, 4. Not enough to hold back the judgment pressing upon Sodoma. And in that moment an eternal truth was revealed. Sometimes heaven waits, but it does not delay forever, and the silence of God can also be a warning. When Abraham told Lot there was no more room for debate, it was the last chance. Because when the Torah shows a man interceding for others, it is also showing us the heart of the Creator himself, a God who longs for mercy, but will not ignore the cries of innocent blood. And Sodoma's cry had already reached beyond the skies. At home, despair and denial, sometimes you come home, but your soul doesn't come with you. That's how it was for me that night. The world outside was about to burn, and I sat in a quiet house, surrounded by the faces I loved. But none of them could feel the weight of what I had seen. The house looked the same, but something had already broken in the unseen. My wife sat at the table, her fingers clenched around a small handful of salt. "We have almost nothing left," she said, but my mind was elsewhere. She spoke of salt. I saw fire falling from the heavens. She spoke of money. I heard Abraham's voice echoing, "Leave Sodoma." And I couldn't find words anymore. Rashi teaches that salt was a symbol of covenant, but in her hands it looked more like a reminder of everything we were about to lose, or maybe what we had already lost and didn't notice. I could barely look at her. She looked at me, but she couldn't see me anymore, and I didn't know who I was either. The tension between us wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual. The house had cracked, because when one hears the voice of heaven and the other does not, the silence between them becomes unbearable. The Zohar teaches that separation begins when hearts stop moving in unity. And that night, our hearts lived in different worlds. I tapped the wood of the table in silence. The dull sound of my fingers was the only thing alive in the room. She turned away, and I realized judgment doesn't begin with fire. It begins with distance. It begins when the sacred is forgotten and the essential becomes spilled salt on the floor. It was time to leave, but no one in that house was ready. Attempt to warn Sodoma. The next morning, I rose with a weight on my chest that wasn't just fear. It was purpose. I walked to the center of Sodoma, feeling the ground throb with sins rising to the heavens. Then I shouted, "Repent! The Eternal will destroy this city." But they laughed. Some mocked, others tried to trade my warning for perversion. "Bring your virgin daughters, then we'll hear your prophecy," they said with cruelty. It pierced my soul like a blade. The city had gone deaf to anything sacred. The Midrash teaches that when the heart closes, even the brightest light looks like madness. And before my eyes, darkness was mocking justice, as if God was just a joke. But I couldn't stop, because when your soul sees the fire before it falls, you can't stay silent. "The Lord sent me to warn you," I cried. But the words dropped like dust to the ground. "Go back to your prophetic games, old fool," someone said. They weren't mocking me, they were mocking heaven. What I felt wasn't anger, it was mourning, like a prophet weeping for a city that had already chosen its fate. The Torah makes it clear, Sodoma rejected the warning. And the Talmud says when judgment draws near, mercy knocks one last time, and if no one opens, it leaves, and with it, the last chance. I stood there for a few seconds, hands at my sides, voice cracking. Every part of me wanted someone to listen, but no one did. And that's how it ends for those who mock the light, not with thunderbolts, but with heaven's silence in the face of human pride. I returned home, covered in dust and silence. Rejection and conflict at home. When I returned home, silence greeted me first. But I already knew she was waiting. My wife stood in the center of the room, arms crossed, eyes sharp under the flickering lamplight. "What were you thinking?" shouting in the streets. Her voice trembled, not with anger, but with fear dressed as control. She didn't see what I saw, but she felt the weight of disgrace. "No one will lend us a coin now. They say your madness has cursed this house." In the corner, our daughters listened quietly, their faces half hidden in the shadows. Fear spread like smoke. The home that once sheltered now felt tight and hostile. The Talmud teaches that when light is rejected outside, it starts being resisted inside. I didn't reply, not because I didn't want to, but because the words no longer belonged to me. All I could do was walk into the darkest corner of the house and fold into myself. My body trembled and the tears came without warning. My spirit broke in front of those I loved most, and who I knew I could no longer reach with words. My daughter took a step forward, hesitated, and stopped. She wanted to speak, but there was no language for that kind of pain. The Zohar teaches that some tears speak louder than cries, and that night it was the silent weeping that said it all. Judgment was coming, and there wasn't enough unity in that home to stop it. I wept in silence until my breath broke. The lamp above flickered, and in that sacred darkness I realized the first collapse of Sodoma happened inside my house. It wasn't the fire that hurt the most. It was the distance between souls that once vowed to walk together and now no longer spoke the same spiritual language. If this stirred your soul, subscribe to the Hidden Torah. The silence is over. Arrival of the angels. That night, when heaven felt too silent, the atmosphere shifted. Two streaks of light sliced the sky like flaming swords, and then silence. But a heavy silence, the kind that comes before a storm. As the smoke cleared, they stood there, two men with ordinary appearance, but no ordinary presence. They walked in like weary travelers, but the spiritual world recognized them as messengers, Gabriel and Uriel. Their names vibrated in the air, even without being spoken. Zohar explains, angels don't descend just with orders, they come with atmospheres. And that night, something sacred had already begun to unravel. The city kept celebrating, but heaven was already standing. Elsewhere, Azrael watched, a being who had aligned himself with Sodoma's darkness, not as victim, but as partner. Before a glowing orb, he saw it all, our faces, our movements. Spiritual time was tightening like a funnel, and where the angels stepped, natural time began to bend. When they knocked at my door, the world was still asleep, but I knew. My heart knew before my eyes did. I invited them in. And when they spoke, it wasn't just words, it was another dimension breaking through. You must leave before sunrise. There is no time to prepare. This wasn't advice, it was judgment. My wife's eyes widened, tears forming. But our things, our life, but the angels didn't speak of possessions. They spoke of time, and time was already tearing. The Torah says when Malachim enter a home, they bring both protection and division. That night, they brought both. Sodoma's era was ending, and the angels knew it first. The siege of Lot's house, they came like a filthy flood. Breaking through the gates, screams, laughter, voices drunk with desire. I saw their eyes through the cracks in the wood. They glowed like beasts smelling blood. "Bring out the men who are with you." They shouted, but they didn't want conversation. They wanted to corrupt what was pure, to defile the sacred before sunrise. I stood still, hand on the latch. I knew what waited outside, but also what it meant to open that door. When I finally did, a stone hit me in the face. Blood ran warm, but I didn't fall. The mob roared louder, their faces more twisted than ever. Then he stepped forward. Azrael, the same one who watched the heavens, now led the darkness. "Hand them over, Lot. We want to know them." The word wasn't innocent. It was the same used in Genesis for intimacy. But this wasn't love. It was spiritual domination. Gabriel and Uriel remained silent, just watching. The Midrash teaches there are tests where heaven watches before it acts, and this was one of them. The city's fate was on the edge. I did the unthinkable. I offered my daughters instead. The mob laughed, mocked, broke me. "Then give us the little one." They jeered, but Azrael changed. His eyes turned to ice. "No, we came for them." It was personal now. No longer Sodoma versus heaven. It was pride trying to devour the light itself. That's when the angels moved. They stepped into the open. Wings ignited like fire. Light burned through the air. The mob staggered back, screaming, blinded by holiness. But Azrael stood still, unshaken, and I understood. He had already chosen. He was no longer flesh trying to be saved. He was darkness, choosing to fight to the end. Supernatural confrontation. What happened next didn't belong to this world. Gabriel stepped forward, and with him the atmosphere shifted. His robes became flames. Wings unfolded as if they had always been there, hidden beneath flesh. Uriel followed, his presence like lightning restrained. They were no longer men. They were living manifestations of heaven. The crowd dropped to their knees, blinded. "My eyes? I can't see," they cried. The light didn't burn their flesh. It exposed their souls. The Zohar teaches that when divine light descends, it separates. Not because it condemns, but because it reveals. And in that revelation they couldn't stand. Except for one. Azrael didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He belonged to the dark. "You twisted this city," Uriel said, his voice calm as thunder. "They chose me," Azrael answered. And yes, they had. He offered freedom, but it was a freedom without soul. A liberation that enslaved through lust and pride. Gabriel raised his hand, and in that gesture, something eternal broke in the spiritual realm. Light erupted from the angel's palm like a river of judgment. Azrael tried to resist. He screamed, but he was consumed by the very fire he sought to control. The Midrash says evil doesn't fall because it is defeated, but because it never had a true foundation. What Azrael embodied was illusion, fed by human desire. When the dust settled, the men of Sodoma lay scattered, groaning, their eyes covered. But the angels remained, alive, untouched, standing like sentinels of the eternal. And that's when I understood the time for mercy had passed. Now all that remained was to run, because judgment had already begun to fall. Escape from Sodoma. They said nothing. They just pulled us. Gabriel took my arm, Uriel held my wife. My daughters followed behind, hand in hand, like fear had fused them together. There was no time to speak, no time to plan. Every second was another crack in the fabric of reality. Judgment had already been unleashed. We ran like shadows, fleeing the very light. The ground shook beneath us, but it was the sky that was collapsing. I didn't know where we were going. I simply followed the silent glow of the angel's presence. The Talmud says, when the messengers of the Eternal guide you, it is not time to question, only to trust. And in that moment, faith was all I had left. The air behind us began to shift. A strange heat, almost alive. The sky opened not as blessing, but as verdict. Lines of fire carved through the clouds like visible sentences. The city screamed, but the time to listen was over. It was too late for repentance. What was falling wasn't just destruction, it was justice. I didn't turn around, but I felt the hesitation behind me. My wife's steps dragged. Uriel held her by the arm. She wept, not for the lost souls, but for the things, for the home, for the possessions left behind. The Midrash warns, those who carry the world in their hearts rarely escape judgment unharmed. Still, we kept going. Sand sank beneath our feet, eyes fixed on the horizon. The only thing that mattered was moving forward. Because one thing was clear to me. The city wasn't just being destroyed. It was being erased from memory, and whoever hesitated would be erased with it. Tragedy, Lot's wife, she walked behind us, but her heart was still there. In Sodoma, in everything she built, decorated, touched. The Zohar teaches that judgment doesn't just divide bodies, it divides intentions. And in that moment, the visible began responding to the invisible. Do not look back wasn't advice, it was a spiritual boundary, and she crossed it. I didn't need to see, I just knew. The sound stopped. Her presence vanished, and when I turned, there was only emptiness. My wife was no longer among the living. The ground didn't shake, but something inside me did, a pillar of salt. Not as physical punishment, but as eternal symbol. The salt that once sealed covenants now marked a warning. Not all can be carried into a new age. I wept, but no prayer could bring her back, because her loss wasn't punishment, it was choice. Her attachment to the past kept her from stepping into the future. The Talmud teaches, in certain moments, hesitation means perishing. And in that instant, I understood the greatest obstacle between man and redemption is nostalgia for what God has already left behind. My daughters said nothing. Their faces were pale, but dry. They understood. Grief didn't need words. We kept walking, but I felt lighter and more hollow. Something had been torn away, and at the same time something had been revealed. Mercy departs gently, but judgment seals without delay. We stopped in a cave as fire devoured the horizon. The sky burned like a scroll being erased by flame. I sat down. My hands touched the earth. For the first time I realized I survived, but not whole, because the woman who walked beside me could never release what heaven had already let go. The final decay, incest and despair, the cave was dark, but not darker than my soul. I didn't cry anymore. I didn't speak. Silence was my only refuge. Everything was gone. The city, my wife, my honor, all consumed by fire or memory. I no longer knew if God had saved me or simply left me alive to remember. Because sometimes what remains isn't life, it's aftermath. My daughters were there, silent, watching me with eyes that no longer held childhood. They hadn't just seen the fire, they had felt the abandonment. And what becomes of a soul that watches the world collapse and still wakes up the next day? The Talmud speaks of a trauma beyond words, a kind of pain that drives a person into lightless choices. It happened on one of those nights. I was drunk, not from desire, but despair. They made me drink, and I fell into deep sleep. The rest I learned later. I was taken, violated, confused by the very ones who carried my blood. They thought humanity had ended, that they had to act to preserve life. But in the name of survival, they destroyed what little holiness remained. The Zohar says some actions are born from fear, yet still cast long shadows. And in that act a dark seed was planted, not out of malice but misdirected desperation. I didn't blame them, but I was never the same, because what wounded me wasn't just what they did, but what it revealed about who we had become. In that cave, with the echoes of Sodoma still burning in the sky, I understood that judgment doesn't end with fire. It lingers in everything the fire leaves behind. I was spared, but not untouched. And maybe that was the true judgment. Not to die with the wicked, but to live long enough to carry the weight of what you refused to leave behind when there was still time. Closing the city is gone. The fire erased the streets, the faces, the names. No memory remained. No prayer remained. Sodoma wasn't just destroyed, it was removed from time itself, as if heaven declared, "This cannot remain among the living." And I remained, empty, a survivor of something that can't be told without pain. The voices are gone, the gates, the parties, the laughter, all burned by the same fire they refused to fear. Because judgment never comes without warning. It comes after many, and what Sodoma ignored was the final whisper of mercy. The Torah doesn't record the names of the mockers, but it remembers those who, even in chaos, tried to listen. Now, only we remain, a father, 2 daughters, and a grief with no language. The sages say true exile begins when the body survives, but the soul loses direction. That's what happened to me. I didn't go to hell, but I was no longer whole. I was spared, so I could remember. Some truths only come after the fall. That attachment kills more than fire. That God's silence is also a language. And when angels say go, it's not to save your body. It's to save your soul. If there's anything in you still resisting, it's time to let go, because the time for decision has already begun. And now that you've heard, you know too. What will you do with this truth? Will you bury it deep, or let it transform what still can be saved? I was spared to remember, but you're still hearing the voice, and the choice still lives inside you. And if this message stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Subscribe now to the Hidden Torah, turn on the bell, and get ready for the next video. The journey continues, and each revelation is a piece your soul has longed to recover. You don't need to understand it all right now, but you do need to stop pretending you don't feel it. If something is waking up inside you, feed it, don't bury it. Simple practice. Tonight, before sleep, light a single candle. No rush, no rehearsed prayer. Just sit in silence for 2 minutes and ask, what must I still let go of so I don't turn to salt? Whatever comes, write it down, not to analyze, but to remember.